Good afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Zach Myers with the Center for Dairy Excellence, and welcome to this month's live version of the Protecting Your Profits. Just like always, my goal is to provide an overview of markets, current dairy markets, and review risk management opportunities. And as usual, this is all public information, and while I may express some opinions, these are not recommendations. And with that, we'll just go on into the presentation. So Emily, if you'll go ahead and advance. So similar agenda as normal, we do have a guest speaker today. Dr. Haley Springer is with us, and I'll introduce her in just a few minutes. But first, we'll look at current markets. We'll look at export data for May, and then dairy margin coverage, and a little bit on dairy revenue protection. All right, and go ahead, Emily. Back one slide. So at almost 19.9 billion pounds of milk production, U.S. milk production was down just slightly at 0.02% compared to June. U.S. cow numbers were down 5,000 head from a year ago to 9.408 million. And this is 16,000 less than May 2023 revised numbers. Milk production per cow was basically flat, just up 0.05% at 2,111 pounds per cow, which is just 1 pound more than what she produced last year. Pennsylvania cow numbers are down about 1,000 head from last year and equal to April at 466,000 head. Pennsylvania has been able to maintain its herd size through the first half of 2023. Pennsylvania milk output per cow, like the U.S., experienced a drop in Europe compared to last year, but at a steeper rate of 1.7% at 1,770 pounds of milk per cow. This is 30 pounds less than a year ago. The 1,000 cow decline in herd size coupled with decreased milk production per cow led to a total production of 825 million pounds, or 16 million pounds less than June of 2022. With coal cow prices up and milk prices down 22,700 head, more cows went to beef markets through June than did 1 year ago, and it's the second month with the double-digit increases year over year. Next slide. June butter stocks were up about 5% to 348 million pounds. Cheese stocks were basically flat, down almost 0.3% to 1.51 billion pounds. And then May, again, the May number for non-fat dry milk is a month behind the others, was down over 5% to 300 million pounds. Next slide. At $2.42 per pound, June butter price was 52 cents less than last year. The global dairy trade and EU butter prices are both lower than the U.S. price by 26 and 12 cents respectively. But all three prices are converging relative to 1 month ago. So meaning that the U.S. prices are starting to come in line with international prices, which hopefully moving forward, at least in the export market, will help the United States. And we'll talk about exports a little bit better and the challenges that are facing exports currently. So next slide. So May dairy product production butter, again, the production numbers are a month behind. So May butter production at 194.4 million pounds is up about 8% year over year. Cheese is down, relatively flat, but down 0.2% at 1.203 billion pounds. And then non-fat dry milk has increased 7% year over year, and which makes sense with sales down and it's more milk that is able to go into powder. Next slide. All right, on the demand side, butter at 170 million pounds of disappearance is up 4% year over year. Exports are down 30%. Domestic usage is up 4%. And then the domestic usage of butter accounts for 96% of the disappearance in this past May. Total cheese, so American plus other style cheeses at 1.207 billion pounds, is up nearly 1% year over year, with exports down 14%, but the domestic usage up 2%. So again, like butter, most cheese made in the U.S. stays in the U.S., so domestic usage accounted for 94% of the disappearance during May. And on the powder side, non-fat dry milk and skim milk powder, 249 million pounds. This is up 10% year over year, with a decline in exports of nearly 3%, and domestic usage increased a pretty substantial 61%. So unlike cheese and butter, most of the powder that's made in the U.S. is exported. So exports accounted for 70% of the disappearance in non-fat dry milk and skim milk powder in the month of May. Next slide. Now on the milk price side, the graph you see here is based off of 7/24's closing prices. The class 3 price, or the blue line, hits its low this month at $13.77 a hundredweight, then jumps to $17.46 in August, peaks in December at $19.50 before dropping back to the mid-18s by next spring. At $18.30, the 12-month average class 3 milk price is $1.15 more than last month, and 17 cents above the 5-year average, or the red line, of $18.88 per hundredweight. Class 4 milk price, or the green line, hits its low at $17.44 in September, then climbs into the mid-19s by November before dropping into the low to upper 17s through most of the spring of 2024. At $18.06 per hundredweight, the 12-month price is 31 cents more than last month, and still 64 cents more than the 5-year average of $17.42. That's represented by the purple line. Next slide. Okay, on the export sides, exports were down 13% year over year at 354 metric tons of milk solid equivalent dairy products. This value is also down nearly 20%, and it's down for the third consecutive month, and the average, or estimated value, of $732.4 million. So the U.S. price in general has been, in the first half of the year, has been higher than the world price. So that's really affected exports this year. The only, I guess, the good thing is that with proximity to Mexico, exports to Mexico year over year are actually up significantly. So that's helping those export numbers, but we're losing market share to the EU and Oceania in other parts of the country. Next slide. Go ahead and go on to the next. So moving into risk management, dairy margin coverage, the May margin was announced at the end of June at $4.83 per hundredweight. This is the lowest margin in the history of the dairy margin coverage program. It triggers a $4.67 indemnity at the maximum $9.50 margin coverage. This is about $3,670 per 1 million pounds of enrolled production history, or about $18,350 at the 5 million pound, for an operation that caps that's at that 5 million pound cap. The May indemnity provides an additional net benefit of 37 cents per hundredweight for the year, and a total net benefit of $1.16 per hundredweight for the dairy margin coverage program year 2023. Feed costs decreased by 39 cents to $14.47 per hundredweight compared to April. But as we all know, the milk price took a pretty good nosedive and fell $1.40 to $19.30 compared to April. The June margin will be announced this Friday, July 28th, after 3 o'clock. Next slide. Next slide, Emily, if you can, please. All right, so looking at the decision tool, the online decision tool based on market closing prices on July 24th, the DMC projects payments each month this year, with June margin approaching the catastrophic margin, and the July margin is 28 cents below the $4 catastrophic margin. If the July margin stays below $4, it will be the first time in program history to become less than the free catastrophic $4 DMC coverage, margin coverage. So we're sort of at for 3 months in a row, the DMC margin is expected to set a new record low. If these margins were to become reality, DMC is projected to provide a net benefit of $2.71 per hundredweight for the year. This is equivalent to about $27,000 per 1 million pounds of enrolled production history, up to that tier 1 cap, or about $135,500 for an operation that maxes out that tier 1 cap. And you can go ahead and advance 2 more slides. For dairy revenue protection, 100% class 3, 95% price protected floors are relatively similar across all quarters, ranging from a low of 1746 in the fourth quarter of next year to 1784 in the first quarter of next year. For some reason, the Q1 2023 policies were not available on July 24th, probably due to market conditions. All right, next. On the class 4 side, I can't tell, Emily, are you on the class 4 side slide?
Yes,
okay.
I believe.
100% class 4, 95% price protected floors for the first 3 quarters are similar at 17. Well, from a low of 1724 in the fourth quarter of next year to a high of 1850 the fourth quarter of this year, and you can see the prices there that they're at. So prices are in the close-up months, as per usual, are cheaper than the further out months in general, but also less likely to trigger indemnities versus the further out quarters. So even though these prices and floors are much lower than what they were a year ago, depending on cost of production at your operation or your client's operations, might be, if they're not in the DMC program or DMC that inadequately cover their production level, these floors are at least worth considering and taking a look at to have some protection. So with that, I think that's my last slide. If you'll go to the next slide, and then so next with us and for covering the rest of our hour here, Dr. Haley Springer's with us to talk about biosecurity. Dr. Springer is an associate clinical professor and extension veterinarian at Penn State. She began her academic career after time in both mixed and dairy-only veterinary practice. Her ongoing clinical work primarily revolves around calf health and management of infectious disease in cattle. She is also involved in both livestock-related and vector-borne disease extension work, as well as teaching in livestock production, veterinary science, and One Health courses. Her research interests are in pre-harvest food safety with a focus on managing antimicrobial resistance and dairy and veal farms. And with that, Haley, Dr. Springer, I'll turn it over to you, and you can share your screen and go through your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So today, Zach asked me to talk a little bit about biosecurity and kind of tie it into how we can utilize biosecurity to protect our dairy operations. And so when I talk about biosecurity, I really like to split it into kind of 2 realms of biosecurity. And we're going to really talk about the who, what, why, and how of each of these realms of biosecurity. And the first is everyday biosecurity. These are the biosecurity protocols that every dairy should have in place and utilize on a routine basis. The other that has come kind of to greater light lately is enhanced biosecurity. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can utilize enhanced biosecurity, which is really targeting diseases that we don't necessarily have here in the United States yet, and hopefully never do. But it will allow us to continue to do business through some of those disease outbreaks should we ever see them here in the United States. So let's start off focusing on that everyday biosecurity side of things. So who is involved in everyday biosecurity? Well, the simple answer is you just need to answer the question, who sets foot on your dairy? Because everyday biosecurity is truly for everyone. So these are the practices that whether it's a visitor coming on the farm just briefly to deliver a package, or the owner or manager that's there day in and day out needs to follow on a regular basis. So the who is quite simple here in everyday biosecurity. It truly is everyone. So what is everyday biosecurity? Everyday biosecurity is looking at how diseases can either enter the herd or spread through the herd, and how we can stop those processes. I think an important aspect of understanding biosecurity practices is to understand how diseases spread. And so the main ways that we spread disease from animal to animal, whether it's on farm or between farms, are things like vector-borne disease. And so we certainly have certain vector-borne diseases that are becoming a greater concern here, at least locally. We have iatrogenic transmission. And so iatrogenic transmission is really when we transmit disease. So you see that I have a syringe there. One of the most common ways that we transmit disease in an iatrogenic manner is through reuse of needles. We also, of course, have direct contact between animals that can spread disease. We have oral, and I have feces here because fecal oral is our most common method of oral transmission of disease. We have aerosol transmission of disease. We have fomites. So this might be a term you don't recognize, but a fomite is any inanimate object that transmits disease. And so we often see fomites paired with something like a fecal oral disease because things like boots can carry manure that can then infect other animals. And then we have reproductive related diseases. So when we look at each of these in terms of what diseases are we actually trying to fight when we're trying to stop these different methods of disease transmission? Well, when we look at vector-borne disease, one that keeps coming up fairly locally is Theileria. So we have a new invasive tick species called the Asian longhorn tick. It is in Pennsylvania, and in fact, we might be adding several more counties where this tick has been found. And we know that at least through the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia and several other states, this tick is carrying a disease of cattle called Theileria. It's specifically called Theileria orientalis genotype Icata, but it causes an anemia disease of animals. This is transmitted by the tick, the Asian longhorn tick. And so what are some things that we could do to prevent this type of vector-borne disease? We can look at things like tick control. We also know that a lot of cattle are housed in confinement, and cattle in confinement don't have access to ticks. And so they are very well protected from a disease like Theileria. When we look at iatrogenic transmission, the one that always comes to mind for me is anaplasmosis. And interestingly, anaplasmosis looks a lot like Theileria clinically. But anaplasmosis is a disease of red blood cells. And so red blood cells very easily get onto syringes or needles and can be transmitted from animal to animal. And so anaplasmosis is one of those diseases that I've frequently seen spread through herds due to iatrogenic transmission or transmission on things like needles. And by implementing biosecurity practices to prevent that bloodborne spread, we can almost stop the spread of these diseases. When we look at direct contact, we look at common diseases like BVD. And so certainly vaccination is an important part of biosecurity for BVD, but we also want to be cognizant of where our animals are and whether they have direct contact with neighboring herds or if we're bringing new animals into the herd. So as I mentioned, fecal oral is our classic disease of oral transmission. So I always think of things like E. coli or Salmonella. Those are commonly transmitted to animals via exposure, oral exposure to feces. Aerosol would be things like bovine respiratory disease. So we know that these are diseases that are transmitted by aerosol. And here we're looking at things like how can we improve ventilation to reduce the spread of disease. Fomite transmission often comes back to those fecal oral diseases. And so I have Salmonella listed here. We know that many fecal oral transmitted diseases can be carried on things like boots or tractor tires. And this becomes even more important as we get into more highly pathogenic diseases. And so this is where practices that are really targeting our visitors and making sure that everybody working on the farm has dedicated clothing for our farm can help reduce the risk of disease spread. And then reproductive diseases would be things like IBR. One of the best biosecurity practices for reproductive diseases is to use artificial insemination. Our semen companies, our commercial semen companies have very strong biosecurity protocols to prevent diseases like IBR so that we can be confident in the semen that we're getting. If we are using bulls, we do want to make sure that we're working with a veterinarian to determine good testing to make sure we're not bringing diseases or introducing diseases or spreading diseases within our herd. So that's kind of what we're looking at when we look at everyday biosecurity. But why do we implement everyday biosecurity? And to explain the why, I really want to share a case study with you. So this is a published case study that I've embellished a bit to fit better for this webinar. But this is a case study of a Colorado dairy farm. This dairy farm had just built a new facility. They put in a 60-cow rotary. And that also had a separate parlor for hospital and fresh cows. Because of that new facility, they needed to expand. And that expansion was from 350 to 2,500 milking cows. So obviously they had to purchase animals. They did end up purchasing animals. They purchased both cows and heifers, and those animals came from 15 different sources. All of the sources had a single mycoplasma negative on a bulk tank culture. One of the important things to recognize is that mycoplasma is not consistently picked up on bulk tank culture, especially if it's at low levels in a herd. And so we all typically would recommend multiple bulk tank cultures if we're trying to demonstrate that a herd is truly clear of mycoplasma. So this herd did do some individual cow cultures, but only at freshening and when clinical cases showed up. So they were not routinely culturing individual animals as they entered the herd. So what happened on this dairy? In the first 17 months after their expansion, they had 560 new cases of mycoplasma mastitis. And so we know that mycoplasma is a particularly challenging type of mastitis because it does not respond to any of the antibiotics that we have available to treat mastitis. So we're really limited in how we can manage these animals. It's also a contagious pathogen, so it can be spread through the parlor. When they looked at those 560 cases, 88% of the cases had had a previous visit to the hospital. And when they were in that hospital pen, they had a negative culture. So it's highly likely that 88% of these animals were clear based on a previous visit, but now they ended up with mycoplasma. In addition to what was happening in the cow herd, they also had issues in the calf herd. So we know that mycoplasma, in addition to causing mastitis, can also cause respiratory disease in calves. And so they were seeing calves like this. You can see lots of nasal discharge. You can see those really drooped ears. This calf is really not feeling well. This is kind of a classic severe mycoplasma case. So in the calves, they saw respiratory disease, swollen joints, drooping ears, and a few calves had head tilts. This is pretty classic of mycoplasma disease in a dairy herd. These calves were receiving 4 quarts of raw colostrum within 4 hours of birth, and then they were fed pasteurized waste milk after that. So the why here is really when we start to look at what did this cost and what would it have cost to prevent. So when we look at the cost of the outbreak, if we look just at mastitis culturing, in this case, this farm spent $100,000 on mycoplasma cultures. Culturing mycoplasma is particularly challenging because it doesn't grow under typical culture conditions, so it tends to be more expensive to culture. And so this is a huge expense, but this wasn't the only expense of this outbreak. They had increased culling because remember, mycoplasma can't be treated with antibiotics. And so they culled a lot of their positive animals. They had added labor in the hospital pen because they had more cows in the hospital pen. They had more discarded milk. They had greater calf losses, and they had reduced average daily gain in their calves. So I don't have a quantification on all those numbers, but you can see that those expenses are really going to add up over time. And so the why behind everyday biosecurity is to prevent these really expensive outbreaks. So how could they have done this better? Well, I already mentioned that typically we want to culture multiple times if we're trying to clear incoming animals. We can also use things like quarantine. So if we bring new animals in, keep them in a separate pen, milk them as a separate string until we know that they are disease-free. So when we're looking at everyday biosecurity, I always start by identifying risks. And then we need to identify gaps in the protocol. So we've already identified how this entered the herd, but we also know it's spreading within the herd. So we need to identify the risks for spread within the herd and the gaps in current protection. And then you need to develop protocols to reduce the risk of disease transmission. And anytime I mention protocols, I always mention people, because one of the most important things when it comes to developing protocols is making sure that everybody using them knows how to use them properly. And so people are incredibly important when it comes to everyday biosecurity. And I think this case was a great demonstration of that. And so when we look at mycoplasma transmission, these are the main ways that mycoplasma is transmitted. So direct contact, oral contact, aerosol, particularly when they have respiratory disease, fomite transmission. The fomite, remember, fomite is any inanimate object. So the most common fomite in mycoplasma, particularly mycoplasma mastitis, is the milker unit itself. And then we do have reproductive spread as well. So this herd was using artificial insemination, so we can kind of wipe reproductive spread off of here. That's not going to be a major cause of spread. So how do we have this spreading? Well, one of the things we know is that 88% had previous visit to the hospital pen with a negative culture. So there is a very good chance that those animals acquired mycoplasma while in the hospital pen. So what this farm did is that they identified the hospital pen as a higher risk site of transmission. They took all of their workers. They made sure that they understood mastitis and how mastitis spreads. They made sure that they could accurately and quickly recognize mastitis. They made sure their workers understood the methods to prevent mastitis transmission during milking. So making sure that we're using clean gloves, that we're not sharing towels between animals, and all of the different methods that we can use to prevent transmission during milking. They worked with workers to make sure they were using proper treatment technique and that they were utilizing proper milking machine disinfection. After this, so when they looked at mycoplasma cases, prior to training, they were seeing 1 to 2 new mycoplasma cases a day. After they trained their workers in the hospital pen, that dropped to about 1 to 2 cases per month. And most of those cases had no history of time in the hospital parlor. So here we can see that building a good protocol and making sure that people are trained can have a huge impact on everyday biosecurity. So that takes care of direct contact and fomite transmission that was happening within the parlor, but we also have it getting from the cows to the calves somehow. So when we look at the calves, they changed protocols such that they started to heat treat colostrum, because if we look at risks, raw colostrum is a significant risk of oral transmission of this disease. So they heat treated the colostrum. They trained employees to recognize early signs of respiratory disease, and then they moved sick calves to outdoor hutches. By moving sick animals out of the main barn space, they reduced aerosol spread of disease. So now they've identified risks for oral and aerosol transmission and developed protocols to prevent that. And so we already talked about the challenges of those new cattle as well. And so in this example, we hope that we never get to that point, because if we have good protocols ahead of time, we should not see these big disease outbreaks. But we can see in this example how developing good protocols can help us stop a disease outbreak. And that farm's going to be better prepared to prevent disease outbreaks of diseases that we see every day in the future. Another good resource in terms of everyday biosecurity is the new farm manual. So Farm has published an everyday biosecurity manual that can help walk you through building a good biosecurity plan. And so that's another resource that's available in terms of everyday biosecurity. So we've looked at the who, what, why, and how of everyday biosecurity. Now let's shift gears and talk a little bit about enhanced biosecurity. So who is involved in enhanced biosecurity? This gets much more complicated. So when I look at enhanced biosecurity, there are people involved in preparation for enhanced biosecurity. These are going to include the Department of Agriculture, the secure milk supply, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the future in a few slides, owners and managers of dairies, select employees of dairies. And so preparation takes an important set of people, and it takes a specific process. And we're going to walk through what that process looks like. We have these enhanced biosecurity plans so that we're prepared to implement them in the event of a foreign animal disease outbreak. And when we look at those situations where we might have to implement these plans, who is involved becomes much greater. So now we have USDA involved, because they're always going to control what's going on when we do have a foreign animal disease outbreak. The Department of Ag is still going to be heavily involved in this. We're also going to come back to that secure milk supply program, which we'll talk about more later. Owners and managers of dairies are, of course, still involved. Employees, and here we have pretty much every employee involved. Visitors, and truly everyone that sets foot on or near the dairy is going to be impacted if we're implementing these enhanced biosecurity protocols. So what is this? So an enhanced biosecurity protocol is a heightened biosecurity plan that's approved by state officials to speed acquisition of a permit in the face of a high consequence animal disease outbreak. We often refer to them as continuity of business plans, because speeding acquisition of a permit can help you continue to move milk even in the face of an outbreak. And that really is the goal of having these enhanced biosecurity plans in place. When we look at developing enhanced biosecurity plans, particularly when we look on the dairy side, foot and mouth disease is really the reason behind it. That's really the why of an enhanced biosecurity plan. Though there are other diseases where these could be implemented, foot and mouth disease is kind of the classic one. And one of the reasons other than it being a major risk in terms of foreign animal disease in our livestock here in the US, particularly cattle, another reason that it's important to design enhanced biosecurity programs around foot and mouth disease is because foot and mouth disease is transmitted by every single one of the methods of disease transmission that we talked about. So controlling foot and mouth disease takes a very comprehensive biosecurity program. So when we look at foot and mouth disease, you may hear it referred to as hoof and mouth disease, and I really wish we could change the name. The big reason I wish that is that it is a different disease than hand, foot, and mouth disease, which can affect human children. And so I think if we ever get this disease, it's going to be difficult to make that differentiation. But foot and mouth disease is not zoonotic. It does not cause disease in people. What it does cause is ulcerations in our livestock. So here what we're looking at, you can see a swine hoof, and those reddened areas around the hoof and the dew claws are giant ulcers. We can also see an ulcer. The middle picture is the tongue of a cow. And so this is where it gets that foot and mouth disease, because these are the classic locations of ulcers. And you can see that raw area, but if you also notice, much of that tongue is kind of whitish. That's all ulcerated skin as well on the tongue. And the final picture on the far right is a teat end. So even though it's foot and mouth disease, it does cause lesions elsewhere. And so we can see some development of blisters on the teat end as well. So this disease is not particularly deadly to livestock. But even based on these pictures, I think we can all recognize that this is going to have huge impacts on animal well-being, animal comfort, and their ability to get up and get food and function in a typical manner. And so this is really a disease we do want to make sure if we ever get it, and we want to avoid getting it in the country to begin with, but then we want to make sure we can stop those outbreaks quickly. And this is why. So foot and mouth disease is a disease of cloven-hooved animals. So that means it does impact cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. It can impact other cloven-hooved animals as well, though to a somewhat lesser degree than particularly cattle and pigs. But it does not impact any non-cloven-hooved animals. So that includes people. Horses are not impacted. Our house pets are not impacted. Birds, rats, and mice and fox are not impacted. But it's important to remember that these non-affected animals and people can still spread this disease by spreading manure or other secretions from an animal. Why do we look to foot and mouth disease? Because it really is in large portions of the world. And though there is progress being made in South America to end the foot and mouth disease that we have there, we do still have countries utilizing vaccination to help control that disease, but we hope that that will improve. But even if we do get foot and mouth disease out of South America, we can see that so here the gray countries that you see do not have an official status for foot and mouth disease. The red countries have a suspension of free status. So we can assume at least in most of those countries, there's some level of foot and mouth disease spreading amongst cattle. So it is a true risk here in the US because it is so commonly found throughout the world and it's so easy to transmit. So if we were to get a foot and mouth disease outbreak, what happens? And this is directly from USDA APHIS, and this is what they consider kind of their critical activities in response to one of these situations. So they're going to implement hold orders and standstill notices, and this is going to be for regions and zones around known infected premises. They're going to establish a control area, set up quarantine and movement controls, and then eventually start to release animal movement through continuity of business plans that then allow people to acquire permits to move that milk or animals. So what do these control areas look like? This is the typical diagram we see of control areas. Here we can see that pinpoint white infected premise in the middle, an infected zone around it, and then the buffer zone surrounding that. And that's usually up to about 10 miles in diameter. And so in order to move anything out of the infected zone or the control zone, you would need a permit. This is what they might look like if we have a small outbreak here in the United States. But one of the challenges is if we have a larger scale outbreak, understanding where cattle have moved is going to be a lot more difficult, and it's highly likely that USDA will greatly expand that buffer zone just to be on the safe side. And so in more severe outbreaks, we might see big chunks of states incorporated into those buffer zones. So that's those blue sections there. And in particularly large outbreaks, we may see entire states incorporated into those buffer zones. And that means that there is no movement of animals or milk within those buffer zones, within those entire states. And that's where making sure we're prepared with a continuity of business plan comes in. So having a continuity of business plan, make sure that the dairy that's involved is prepared for this outbreak and has the heightened biosecurity. How we work through this is through the Secure Milk Supply Program. And so this program helps outline what we need to do to prepare for an outbreak such as this. So when we have managed movement, we need a permit from the state of origin and destination to move milk. So there's that control zone, but remember that control zone could look like the whole state of Pennsylvania. So how do we go about developing that enhanced biosecurity program? Utilizing the Secure Milk Supply, that's mainly targeting moving milk. We also have the Secure Beef Supply, which is a similar program targeting moving cattle. We also have others targeting other species. So the cattle and sheep and swine oriented ones are all focused on foot and mouth disease, with pork also being focused on African swine fever, and poultry, of course, being focused on high path AI. avian influenza. So those are the programs that we have to work with. I'm obviously going to focus on the secure milk supply here, because certainly for a dairy, moving milk is the #1 priority, because that's something that needs to be done on a daily basis. So when we have a secure milk supply program and we have farms that fall within a buffer zone, we're probably going to have 3 different types of farms. We're going to have farms that have no pre-planning done. We're going to have farms that have a biosecurity plan written, but maybe not approved, maybe not even an enhanced biosecurity plan. And then we're going to have farms that have approved secure milk supply plans. This would be an approved enhanced biosecurity plan on file with the Pennsylvania Department of Ag. When PDA or other states are approving permits, these farms with no pre-planning would have to develop a biosecurity plan and get it approved and then get the permit. Those with a biosecurity plan would still need to get it approved, but those sitting there with an approved secure milk supply plan are going to be at the front of the line to get those permits. And so this really does allow the best continuity of business, because it's going to give us the shortest turnaround time to get a permit from PDA or or the state of destination. So when we look at secure milk supply, one of the things that we recognized in the Northeast is that often milk leaves the state. And so having a state by state secure milk supply that may not have good communication back and forth between other states is not particularly valuable. In at least through 2017, we had a strong mid-Atlantic secure milk supply. And currently Pennsylvania Department of Ag is working to rebuild these relationships so that we can make sure that if you have an approved secure milk supply plan in Pennsylvania, that will transmit to any of these other states involved in the mid-Atlantic secure milk supply. We also have a New England secure milk supply program, and then several individual state secure milk supply programs out west. So we're fortunate to have that flexibility, and we hope to make sure that all of those relationships are maintained between states so that we can continue to utilize that. So when we look at how we implement or how we build this enhanced biosecurity plan, it really is all about building a plan you're prepared to implement in the face of an outbreak. So what does this plan involve? So based straight off of secure milk supply program information, we start out with just some really basic information on the farm. And so we need things like a premise ID number, your location, any secondary locations, what animals are on site, what type of animal housing, and whether there are other businesses on site. In addition to this, we need to identify key personnel. So this is going to include a biosecurity manager. This obviously does not have to be a dedicated position, but we need to make sure there's somebody in the farm who will be dedicated as a biosecurity manager. And then we need a backup for that individual. And then we also are likely going to have people assisting with plan development, whether that's a consultant, whether that's a veterinarian. Those individuals also need to be identified on a secure milk supply program. When we look at the role of the biosecurity manager, in order to maintain that biosecurity plan, we have to have yearly training on foot and mouth disease biosecurity. They have to be prepared in the event of an outbreak to train and inform those entering the farm of all applicable biosecurity measures. And they have to make sure that in the event of an outbreak, the key personnel understand the biosecurity plan. One of the biggest parts of the secure milk supply program is developing a line of separation that separates your farm from the outside world. This restricts entry to the operation. It also means you need to maintain a record of all persons and vehicles crossing the line of separation. It identifies cleaning and disinfection stations for any vehicles entering. And so remember, this is something we're going to implement in the face of an outbreak and not necessarily on a day-to-day basis. And it plans for specific needs for the farm, such as making sure we can get the milk truck on and off the farm safely, how to manage harvest, and how to manage things like livestock movement. It also includes emergency and contingency plans for things like how to handle an inability to move milk or animals, how to move semen and embryos, carcass disposal, manure management, and rodent and wildlife control. Some of these things should be part of your everyday biosecurity plan, particularly carcass disposal, manure management, and rodent and wildlife control. And so these are important aspects of everyday biosecurity, but they are part of what's required for a secure milk supply program. So when we look at a line of separation, this is a pretty typical line of separation map. So what we see is the red line around this farm is that line of separation. The orange sections here and here are areas where that are considered controlled access points. So in the event of an outbreak, those are the only ways that anyone should be entering that farm. We can see these green diamonds. That is where vehicle cleaning and disinfection will occur to make sure that nothing in terms of disease is coming onto the farm or leaving the farm. The blue line is a public road. The green line is the proposed route for the milk truck into the milk house. We also have all employees parking outside of the barn and entering via that controlled access point. These lines of separation can get kind of creative to make it more functional for the dairy. So here's another example of a line of separation around another farm. Here we can see a controlled access point down in this lower left-hand corner. We can see the employee parking and a controlled access point in the lower right-hand corner. And we see the milk house here. And what this farm has been able to do is they actually designate part of the milk house as outside of the farm. This allows them to bring the milk truck in without having to clean and disinfect that truck. So it greatly speeds up operations on a day-to-day basis, should we ever be faced with a foot and mouth disease outbreak. And so the milk truck is able to come up, get the milk, and leave. One thing that this does make a little more challenging is now nobody from inside the farm can enter this room because it's considered outside the farm. We can also get even more creative. So here's a little bit smaller dairy. And what they were able to do here we have a controlled access point over here with employee parking, another controlled access point on this edge of the farm. And then where the milk truck comes in, you can see how they worked the line of separation, such that now the whole truck doesn't cross. We only have a hose crossing that line, which greatly reduces the need to clean and disinfect in the face of an outbreak. So we've talked a bit about everyday biosecurity and the value of having an everyday biosecurity plan. And I think they are really important. Your veterinarian is a great resource for helping build those everyday biosecurity programs and make sure that everybody on your farm has a good knowledge of what the biosecurity plan is and how to implement it. And then we've also talked about enhanced biosecurity. And this really is, I've heard it referred to as an insurance plan. And I think it is important to almost look at it that way. So this is a plan that's going to take some work to put in place, but it really puts your farm in a position to continue doing business, even if we were faced with a foot and mouth disease outbreak or another foreign animal disease outbreak. And so with that, I am happy to take any questions anybody might have.
Thank you, Dr. Springer. Really appreciate your insight and your knowledge on this topic. And at this point, if there are any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask them, or if you want to put them in the chat box, we'll monitor the chat box and you can ask your question that way. So I guess to get it started, you talked a little bit about that you're in the process of creating some plans that would be or process to be permitted, and those permits be multi-state approved. So can you talk a little bit more? I know I've been involved in the process a little bit, so the center has as well. So can you talk a little bit more on what you're planning on doing there, about the template that you're creating, and provide a little bit of a time frame, if you have one, to let folks know what's going on and when they can expect to see those templates coming out?
Sure. So the Secure Milk Supply Program provides some guidance on building these enhanced biosecurity plans, but a group of individuals heavily involved in the dairy industry. So we have a dairy working group that includes the center, University of Pennsylvania, Penn State, and PDMP, we all got together and realized that we really need a more straightforward way to build these biosecurity programs, these enhanced biosecurity programs. And so we're currently working with PDA to build a template. It's not necessarily going to be a check the box type template, but more of a guided document to help you build these programs for your dairy. There may still be some need for assistance in building these, particularly when it comes to designing that line of separation that we talked about. We're in the process of kind of converting the secure milk supply recommendations into more of a templated form that'll be a little bit easier to work with. And we're really hoping, I think right now we're targeting late fall to hopefully have that ready to roll. And so we're really looking forward to having that as a tool to help make this process a lot less daunting.
Great, thank you for that follow-up information. We did have one question come in on the chat. How does the presence of other species on the farm affect the biosecurity plan? Horses, donkeys, goats, chickens that are more household or family companion animals than commercial livestock?
So those will kind of need to be addressed on a case-by-case basis, depending on the animals. In the event of an outbreak, if you have other animals on the farm, we certainly would need to restrict their access to barns so that they aren't transmitting disease between animals. We've also seen instances where we've had an outbreak in one species that then affects movement of another species. So we've had instances where avian influenza has locked down a farm. That farm also had other animals, which greatly restricted movement of those animals and any animal products associated with them. So it is important, even if they're household pets, that we have them incorporated into that program. And it may be as simple as just making sure we have a way to confine them away from the farm, particularly for our companion animals and potentially even backyard type chickens.
I don't see any other questions. Again, type of question in if you have one. I did think of another one, but I lost it. So that give me a second, see if I can come up with it again. But and again, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question verbally, that's okay too. So keep that in mind. And give me another few seconds, see if I can come up with what. You mentioned foot and mouth disease and how the name can potentially cause issues with the general public that don't understand it. Is there in some of these talks, is there any kind of plan that if we ever, heaven forbid, have a FMD outbreak, that we can make sure that we can attempt to influence or control the dialogue around the human health concern that might be a result of an outbreak?
So in terms of, I don't know that we've had a lot of discussion on how we're going to work with the public on this. I think there will be challenges because of that close name association between foot and mouth disease and hand, foot and mouth disease. And so I think there will be some big public relations concerns there. But in terms of human health, it really is not a zoonotic disease. So I think that the biggest challenge is going to be the public relations side of it and helping the public understand that.
Carol has her hand out. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep,
Yes.
sure can.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for this presentation. Could you share the cost of the equipment needed to wash a milk truck and disinfectant?
It is going to vary a fair bit. And so we can get creative with some of these plans. So for example, back when we were developing some demo farms for this 2016, 2017-ish, I was involved with a farm that was starting to work through the process. And one of the things we did is we identified that there was a pressure washer available at the shop that we could repurpose in the event of an outbreak. So it wasn't necessarily that we had to purchase dedicated equipment for this. We identified where it was and that we would have to make sure it was always in working order, but it was something that was in use on a day-to-day basis on the farm anyways. And then in terms of disinfectant, we did need to have some level of disinfectant on site. And we were able to identify an effective disinfectant that was already being used. And we could meet those needs by just slightly increasing standard inventory. So in some cases, we can get around purchasing dedicated equipment for this by utilizing what we already have on farm.
So they don't need a kind of a trough or a pad to drive on with disinfectant for the wheels?
So there are options for that. You could do it that way, but you can also utilize hand washing. And if you wash and disinfect and then move that truck forward, wash and disinfect again, that can get the entire tire. And so you don't necessarily need to have a concrete pad or any specialized equipment to do this. We do have to make sure that we're managing runoff, and that may be as simple as making sure that we have a vegetative buffer around where we're doing that work. And so there are ways to greatly reduce the cost of this in terms of making an effective plan that is cost effective in the long run, knowing that we aren't we hopefully will never need to implement these.
Great, thank you.
We have time for one last question. There was another question in the chat. Are there plans for Pennsylvania to utilize the forthcoming farm biosecurity tool?
And so we hope to
Farmer
really
Security
work
Responsibility
alongside
Management.
that tool to make sure that we provide Pennsylvania dairy producers with an easy to use tool that we know PDA is ready to utilize. So we are very much recommending the Farm Everyday Biosecurity Manual because we feel that that's a great resource that's already available on the Everyday Biosecurity. And so we're working directly with PDA to make sure we have a template that they approve of. If farm comes out with a template that PDA will also approve, we certainly will support that as well in terms of an enhanced biosecurity plan. But we already do very strongly support the farm everyday biosecurity recommendations.
Great. Thanks again, Dr. Springer, for your knowledge and your presentation today. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Just a couple of announcements before everybody drops off. The next two Protecting Your Profit webinars will be recorded and posted on our website. The next live Protecting Your Profits webinar will be in October, the fourth Wednesday of October, whatever that date is, if you want to mark that on your calendars. And then also lastly, this is my last Protecting Your Profits webinar. I have chosen a position, or I've been offered and accepted a position at Maryland, Virginia Milk Producers Association, and we'll begin that job on August 31st. So thank you everyone for your participation over the last 4.5+ years that I've been doing these webinars, and they are filling this position as soon as possible. Jane actually posted the job description this morning, so that will be available. I'll send a link to that out in my weekly email with the webinar link and the podcast link, so that if you are interested or know somebody that would be interested, you'll have access to that. So with that, thank you again for joining today, and we'll look forward to your participation again in the future. Thank you.